Hey, Patreons, welcome back to the Spotlight. This is, of course, our segment where we talk to creators, writers, directors, etc., in the pop culture space that have brought us so much joy over the years. And this gentleman we're speaking to this evening is absolutely no exception. I've been seeing his name on the screen for Star Trek Productions for decades. Andre Bormanis, good evening.
Good evening.
Glad to have you on the show. So, yeah, boy, we want to hear all about it. So let's jump right on in. How did you get into the world? How did you get into Trek and into kind of science fiction in general? Tell us, please.
Well, it's a long story, but I will give you the sort of Reader's Digest version.
Works.
Um, Always been interested in astronomy, space science. I grew up in the 60s watching, the Apollo program, the moon landings when I was a little boy, and fell in love with Star Trek when I was in high school, when it was in syndication, and became a big fan. Went on to college to study physics and astronomy, did some graduate work in astrophysics, wandered off into the microcomputer field for a few years, and found myself being offered a NASA fellowship to spend 2 years at a place called the Space Policy Institute at George
Wow.
Washington University. So I had a very strong interest in not only NASA, what they were doing scientifically, but sort of the politics behind the space program and how funding decisions were made and how projects were selected. And it was something I didn't know a lot about until shortly after the Challenger disaster in 1986. And I
I
started to
remember.
read about all of the, different factors that came into, you know, uh, shaping the programs, deciding who was going to get money and who was not going to get money and so forth. I'm sorry, is that
No,
did
you're
that
good.
noise? Okay.
Keep rolling. Keep rolling.
Okay.
You're good.
So yeah, I started to read about this place in the wake of the Challenger disaster called the Space Policy Institute. And it was part of George Washington University. It was run by a guy named John Logston, who was a professor there and started the institute. I thought this would be a cool place to study and would combine several of my interests, not only in astronomy, space science, what NASA was doing, but also in politics and policy and writing. I had taken some creative writing classes and taken some screenwriting classes, and in fact, had written a Star Trek spec script back in the days when Star Trek The Next Generation was on the air, and they were taking spec scripts from
Right.
unknown writers. Wrote one, sent it in, got a nice thanks, but no thanks from one of the producers, but he encouraged me to try again. While I was in Washington, D.C., doing a master's degree, this is in the early 1990s now, at, at the Space Policy Institute, I was still developing some story ideas for Star Trek. And I managed to find an agent who was interested in representing me based on the Star Trek spec I'd written, a couple of other things I'd written. She was in the process of trying to get me a meeting to pitch stories to Star Trek The Next Generation when she found out that they needed a new science consultant. And I said,
Wow.
"What's that?" And she said, "Oh, they got a guy on staff. He's a physicist and he helps them with all the science and technical language in the scripts and the science ideas and the stories. He just got bumped up to the writing staff. He was, in fact, one of her agency's clients." So that's how she knew about this opening. And she said they're looking for somebody who has both a real science background, but also knows the show and knows how to read a script. I think you'd be perfect. I'm like, okay.
Oh, yeah.
So she said, let me set up a phone call. So a couple of weeks later, I get on the phone with Jerry Taylor, who was a writer and
Oh, yeah.
supervising producer, I think, at the time on Next Generation. Wonderful writer, wonderful woman, great person. And she and I kind of hit it off over the phone. She invited me to come out and meet with the gang. I happened to be going to a planetary science conference in Tucson about a month later. And while I was there, drove out to Hollywood, to Los Angeles, and met in the Hart Building at Paramount Studios with Jerry, Ira Stephen Bear, Brandon Braga, Renee Echevarria,
Oh,
uh,
man.
Lorraine
The
Shankar,
legends.
predecessor
Yeah.
as the science consultant. I couldn't believe I'm in a room with all of these people, right?
Like, I wouldn't know what to do. And I've been on the Star Trek cruise,
You
so
know, I
I've
was
been.
barely kind of holding it together there. Just,
Yeah.
I was in awe just being on the lot,
Right.
and this was in early spring of 1993. So this was coming up on the final season of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And, we had a very lovely conversation. And Michael Piller, who was an executive producer, of course, and went on to co create Voyager with Jerry and Rick Berman. He was working on a script for Deep Space Nine, which has just premiered in 1992, I guess. And he said, "Yeah, I've written the script. It's got a lot of technical problems. I need some help with some things. This is going to be your audition. I want you to read this script and write up some tech notes and send them to me." Okay. So Narain Shankar showed me the format that he used when giving notes to the writers and producers. Um, I read the script. Next morning, I went to the library. This is pre-internet, not pre-internet, but early internet. You couldn't just
Yeah.
look stuff up online. Did some research. Wrote up 7 or 8 pages of notes. Faxed them to the Star Trek offices at Paramount. Got back on a plane to Washington D.C. A couple of weeks later, I get a call from Jerry Taylor, and she said, "Michael loved your notes. If you want the job, it's yours." They
Wow.
literally needed me to start the week that my NASA fellowship ended. So
Oh,
after 2 weeks in DC, it felt a little fated,
that's
Not that I
wild.
believe in fate necessarily, but the
Right.
timing was kind of perfect. I was still a young man in those days, and I thought, well, you know what? I'll finish my master's degree. It'll be a kick to come out here to Hollywood and try to write for Star Trek. I took the job with the hope that I could eventually sell some stories to them. But of course, when I got there, the first thing I wanted to do was prove to them that, hey, I'm here to do the job you hired me to do, and I want to do it well. So, after 6, 7, 8 months, they were very happy with my work. I was getting a good feel for the show and what they were doing. And, one of the great advantages of being the science consultant is I got to read pretty much every story that they were developing, every first draft, all the revisions, all the way through the final draft to see how those scripts evolve and to
Hmm.
see what worked and what didn't work. And that in and of itself, was a real education. And
Yeah.
of course, I'd watched Star Trek religiously since I was in high school and had
Yeah.
seen every episode of
Same.
Next Gen, some of them at least, a couple of times. And so I knew the show pretty well, but to see the nuts and bolts of how it's made and to read the scripts and then watch the show, very helpful and really provided a lot of insight. So, toward the end of that first year working as the science consultant, I called Jerry's office and asked if I could possibly pitch some stories. And she said, "Oh, sure, please come on over. We'll set up a time." So, a few days later, I was in Jerry's office pitching some stories for Next Generation. And one of my stories she really liked. And I was so thrilled. She was like, "Wow, this is really good. I'm in. I'm in. I'm in." And she said, "Let me take this to Michael and I'll get back to you." Okay, Michael Piller. A week goes by, I hear nothing. 2 weeks go by, I hear nothing. 3 weeks, nothing. So I finally called and I asked to speak to Jerry. And, "Oh, Andre, how you doing?" "I'm good. Hey, did you happen to share that idea that I pitched to you a few weeks ago that you really liked with Michael?" And she's, "Oh, yeah, Michael passed."
No.
Crushed.
Oh,
But that's the nature of the business. You have
right.
to develop a kind of a thick skin. And as good as I think that story was, as good as Jerry thought it was, it didn't pass muster with Michael, and that's what counted.
Yeah. My,
So,
my.
went back to the drawing board, and every few months I would go in and pitch some stories to Jerry. Most of the time, nothing of interest. And finally, I think it was maybe second season of Voyager by the time I finally sold a story. And then a month later, they called to tell me that they'd bought a story I'd pitched sometime earlier that had been on their back burner. And then the following season, they were very shorthanded on the writing staff, and they had a story outlined, but they didn't have anybody to write the teleplay. So Jerry called me out of the blue and said, "Hey, we've got this story, but nobody available on staff to write it. Would you like to take a crack at writing the teleplay?"
Ooh.
Well, sure. And nervously, went and got the outline, went over it with Jerry, went home 2 weeks later, sent in my first draft script. This is back in the days when we had these things called fax machines, which you may have heard
What? I've heard of them. No,
of. Yes,
I'm that old. Don't worry.
I know. Well, I,
Peter
I have
might
to
not be,
remind
but
myself
I've
sometimes how
used
old
them.
I actually am. Yeah, there you go. Okay, well, Peter's
Not very often, but I have used them.
okay. You know the technology.
Oh yeah.
At any rate, I got a call from Jerry a couple of days after I turned it in, and she said, "Very, very good. Everyone really liked it. We're so happy, and you got us out of a bind here." And they ended up not changing a lot of it. Everybody
Well,
gets rewritten, and they
right.
did rewrite parts of it. And there was one big thing that Michael found that he didn't like that he fixed, and I totally understood why he thought, "Oh yeah, we need to have a little something else go on here with Neelix." But still, I was like, wow, I felt kind of I'm on my way now. And my intention had been that if I'd not been able to sell a story to Star Trek or some other show, I was watching the X Files and trying to pitch to the X Files and stuff. If I hadn't been able to make a go of it in the first 3 or 4 years while I'm in LA, and I was having to work some other jobs because the science consultant thing didn't pay a lot of money and wasn't quite enough to make ends meet. So I was doing some other work here and there, writing articles for magazines like Sky and Telescope, helping a small research institute that did planetary science work for NASA, write proposals for grants and things like that. But after I'd sold a couple of stories, written a script, they asked me to do another script. The next year, I kept selling stories. I think I wrote 6 or 7 episodes of Voyager, wrote or co-wrote. And so, I by the time Enterprise came around, Brandon Braga, who I'd worked with, since the beginning, and Brandon and I wrote a script together for the 7th season of Voyager that we felt turned out really well, called Human Error.
Oh
And
yeah.
we liked working together. And he said, we should have brought you on staff a long time ago, but how would you like to be on the writing staff with this new show we're developing, Star Trek Enterprise? And I said, of course. And I was on Enterprise all 4 seasons and left as a producer and have just been doing TV ever since.
Oh my gosh, we interviewed Connor just a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, great.
For this same segment. It'll just kind of drop on our YouTube channel here pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. All right, that was I love that was the Reader's Digest version.
That was the Reader's Digest version, and I'm I could talk forever, and I know I don't want to bore people, but yeah, there was there were a lot more sort of
yeah,
craziness involved in how this all happened, and
yeah,
it's still something that pinch me that I'm doing this,
yeah.
right?
Oh man, I tell
never
you.
would have expected when I was in college, when I was in grad school, even when I was at GW, doing my master's degree, never would have imagined.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
This is
fantastic.
where I would end up.
It's fantastic. Well, I'll let Peter ask a question finally.
Okay, so this is kind of getting into, I guess, the nuts and bolts of how the scientific consulting works.
Yeah.
So when it comes to writing science fiction, there's obviously, with Star Trek particularly, there's a lot of the science bits. And I'm a big fan of, like, I love seeing how, like, it works with real science and
Yes.
how the techno, like, I try to put the puzzle pieces together, but anyway, that's just what I do. But
Sure.
what is your approach to the balance between what we currently know with science, what's scientifically plausible, because Star Trek's always kind of pushing that boundary,
Yes.
and then the balance between those two things, and then where you obviously need to stretch it a bit for the sake of the story?
Well, that's a great question, and that's pretty central to what my job was as the science guy on the show. And I think ER premiered in maybe 94, 95, and
Yeah.
that show really kind of raised the bar on
Right.
technobabble and scientific, and in that case, medical credibility, right? Because Michael Crichton, who created that show,
Yeah.
he was a Harvard grad, in medicine. He had an MD from Harvard, but didn't want to be a doctor, so he went off and started writing, and and so he didn't shy away from that kind of language.
No.
And you really felt, and it added to the credibility of the show. You really felt, you might not have understood what those doctors were talking about when they were cutting into somebody and stopping the bleeding and taking a bullet out of his abdomen or whatever, but you knew that they knew what they were talking about. It was believable. And I always, when I thought about, especially on dialogue, my model was kind of like, if I'm walking down the corridor at JPL and I hear a couple of engineers talking over some technical problem with a spacecraft that they're getting ready to send to Mars or whatever, I may not understand exactly what they're saying in terms of talking about some particular technology I'm not that familiar with. But even so, I would probably have a pretty clear idea after a minute or two that they know what they're talking about.
Yep.
Right. So that's something that was always, front of mind when I was working as the science consultant. And in fact, when I started, I was pretty doctrinaire because that's the way we're trained. And I would get a script and I would read it and I'd say to myself, "That's not possible. Come on, you can't do that. That's blah 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 blah. That's that's fantasy, not science fiction." But then I would stop and I would ask myself, well, wait a minute. Okay, so yeah, in terms of what we understand today, that's not possible. But Star Trek takes place 400 years in the future, at least, Next Gen and Voyager and Deep Space Nine did. Is there some conceivable thing we might discover in these next few hundred years that would change our perception of this? All right. Well, I made myself stretch my imagination, and the writing staff, got to say, um, a lot of really smart people, and not necessarily people with a lot of technical background, um, but people who were certainly sharp, who knew BS when they would see it, who understood the difference between science and pseudoscience,
Yeah.
and who were generally very avid readers of popular science and wanted to know about what's going on in the real world in science and how that might change our future, right?
Hmm.
So generally there was nothing that was like crazy out of line. But what I would always do when there was here's a good example. That final season of Next Gen that I worked on as science consultant, we had an episode where um, there was a planet that was experiencing all this seismic activity and earthquakes, tsunamis,
Yep.
volcanoes.
Yeah.
Like, my God, this is going to wipe us out. Federation, please help. They send Enterprise. We discovered that the core of the planet is cooling and shrinking, and that's what's causing all this seismic activity. And I'm like, oh, okay.
I know.
I can kind of buy that, although the time scale is a little hard to believe in the
It's
sense
not.
that this
It's
is a
not
Class M
44 minutes.
planet. The core of a Class M planet like the Earth is probably mostly iron, nickel, heavy metals, that sink to the bottom while the planet's forming, and 3 or 4 thousand miles across. There is this thing in physics we talk about called thermal inertia. Change the temperature of a very large mass uh, is harder than changing the temperature of a small mass, just like it's harder to push a big heavy thing than it is to push a small light thing. So let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that yes, it is cooling and shrinking in such a way that we're having present day effects, seismic, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Enterprise job was to reheat the core. Now,
Right.
okay,
But of course.
how are we going to do that? Well, that's the science consultant's problem,
No, God.
right? So I thought about it, and what occurred to me is, if you had told somebody less than 100 years ago, and I'm talking less than 100 years ago today,
Yep.
less than 60 or 70 years ago in 1993, if you had told somebody back then that I can raise the temperature of a chunk of metal, heavy, solid metal, the size of a refrigerator, something that weighs a few tons, I can sprinkle some magic particles in that chunk of metal, And within a few hours, the temperature will go up by hundreds of degrees. They would have said you were crazy, right? That's how nuclear fission works. That's
Right.
how a chain reaction works. This is what we discovered in the late 1930s with uranium and later plutonium, that you can initiate these so-called chain reactions where you take a neutron, an invisible subatomic particle. You actually take a bunch of them,
Yeah.
but you can generate neutrons in any number of ways if you have a so-called nuclear pile of uranium 235 or 238 or whatever fissile material you happen to have handy, and you do it in the right way. Well, those initial neutrons will split a bunch of atoms, which will make more neutrons, which will split more atoms. And if you do it in a careful way, you get a nice controlled nuclear reaction that can be used to heat water and make steam and run a turbine and generate electricity, or you can make a bomb.
Yep.
So, for my next gen episode, what I said was, okay, we have established, and this is in the Star Trek technical manual written by Mike Okuda and Rick Sternbach,
Mm-hmm.
that the phasers are a particle beam weapon. And the particle at the center of that beam is called a nadion, which is fictional. It's something
Right.
we made up because we know that if we'd said protons or neutrons or some other particle that actually exists, well, we would be giving the phasers properties that they probably wouldn't have if they were based on these real particles, right? So Mike and Rick somehow came up with nadion. And so I said, all right, here for the purpose of this story, nadions have the property when they were introduced into the core of a planet, which is mostly heavy metals, let's say iron, nickel, maybe some other exotic metals or isotopes. They can initiate a chain reaction that produces splitting atoms, energy, more nadions, a chain reaction. And that will reheat the core of the planet over the time frame of our episode, a few days, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that, yes, is it a bit of a leap? Of course, but it is grounded in logic that is based on real science. So that's what I always tried to do in those kinds of circumstances.
Nice.
Nice. Good
Yeah.
deal. All right. I'll ask you a completely non-science related question. I have my hot take, my minority fan opinion is that the Orville, which is a show that you worked on,
Yes.
I was never a big fan. Now I am kind of sort of a fan of Seth MacFarlane, like I love Family Guy early on, so on and so forth. But there are a lot of people who are consider it part of the Star Trek franchise because it's TNG adjacent, and it kind of drives me nuts. That's a personal take, but stepping outside the role of working on it, or even purely being a Star Trek fan, how do you view the two shows related together? I mean, do you consider them part and parcel, or do you just like, nah?
Oh, no, I think that I mean, they are definitely um, sort of cut from the same cloth in some ways. It's hard for me to be objective in the sense of stepping outside my involvement because I was very involved in that final season of Next Gen. Obviously, I was a writer and producer on The Orville.
Right,
Wrote 7 episodes with Brandon Braga. We were writing partners on the show.
right, right.
I love Seth. I loved working on the show. It was a great experience, and I hope we will do more. Seth says we're going to do more. It's a matter of when, not if. So
that's the
so yeah, it was definitely something that, you know, Seth loved Next Generation. That's the show that shaped him when he was growing up.
Same
And
with me. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, and he missed seeing that kind of storytelling on TV. And of course, the new Star Trek shows, beginning with Discovery and some of the others, until they just started doing Strange New Worlds, they were highly serialized, very different in tone,
Yeah,
very different themes, I think, in a lot of ways. They really, they had a different spirit, I think, than what Gene originally envisioned with the original series and Next Gen. And Seth loved that sort of stuff. And he loved the optimistic future looking, we can get through the troubled times we're experiencing now and explore the galaxy. And he loved episodic storytelling and these sort of little morality plays, these parables in effect, where you view the craziness and the absurdities and the contradictions of our world today through the lens of science fiction. And that's what motivated him to create the Orville. And yeah, was he a fan of of Next Gen? Absolutely. Fan of the original? Absolutely. And so, did he want to be the captain? Yes. Who wouldn't? You know. And because of his great success with Family Guy and American Dad and his other shows, he had the opportunity to do it. So God
Yeah.
bless him. I'm so thankful that he did, and thankful that I was available to be involved in that show. And
Yeah.
yeah, so it is very much in the, I would say, maybe in the storytelling tradition of Star Trek in its earlier incarnations. Um, and you know, that's something I think is clearly resonating with a lot of fans.
Well, I feel like now I should absolutely give it a second go, because yeah,
You should.
I was just always, you know, like, oh, what 5 TNG plots are they going to put in this one episode of the Orville? And I was like, but now that I've talked to somebody who is so
Yes.
integrally involved, I feel like I'm willing to open my heart again. So that's
Well, please do,
Good.
because you know, I think that when I revisit things, you know, I have a different attitude sometimes. You know, I was probably skeptical like you when I first heard that this was happening. And then I read the pilot script and I thought, wow, this is a fresh take. You know, we tried to make Enterprise fresh by setting the show 85, 90 years in the past of the
Mhm.
original. And so the characters were people more like people today. They weren't
Right.
these big, heroic, you know, Captain Kirk's, Captain Picard, Captain Janeway, Cisco characters who beaming down on the new planet for the first time is just another day at the office,
Right.
right? For Archer and Trip and everybody, it's like, oh my God, we're on a new planet. You know,
Yeah,
so
right.
that gave us a different perspective, a different way to tell those stories.
Right.
And you know, a lot of them were, you know, themed around some of the things that we did in earlier shows, but with a more contemporary, I think, slant.
Yeah.
And yeah, with the Orville, I think we there is more humor in the show. It's not Family Guy in space, which I think is what a lot of people were expecting, and that might have
Yeah.
disappointed some of those fans. But yeah, you know, there is always a place, I think, for shows that have that kind of perspective, optimism, that are willing to tackle um, moral questions, big questions, the meaning of existence, God, life in the universe. What do we owe other life forms? What do we owe each other? You know, those kinds of larger existential questions. And of course, you know, 700 some odd episodes of Star Trek have been produced. Hard not to trip over some of the things
Right.
Yeah.
that have come before. We had that problem when we were doing Voyager and Enterprise. You know,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
remember we were in the, you know, we'd be in the room and in the writers' room, right, on Enterprise. Oh, I got a great idea. Here's a story. Oh, wow, that's amazing. Oh yeah, and then you know, after 10 minutes, somebody, wait a minute. Wasn't that episode 146 of Next Generation? Didn't we do something very similar to that?
It's like and I think it was Family Guy that came around to it, or South Park that said, "Well, The Simpsons did it. The Simpsons did it." It came down to the same thing. As Simpsons has been on for 36, 7 years
It's
now.
Yeah.
older than I am.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh my gosh. Oh
Amazing.
my. Well, we're just about at time. I mean, we could continue to talk to you for the rest of time, because just so much fascinating stuff. But
Oh,
what are you working on right now? How do people discover your work? Where do they need to tune in?
you know, the most recent show I worked on was The End Is Nigh with Bill Nye the Science Guy, created by
Ooh,
Bill and Seth and Brandon Braga. We did 6 episodes. They aired on Peacock. I think you can probably still find them on Peacock. That came out in
cool.
2022, I believe. And then, you know, the writers went on strike and the actors. And since then, I've been pitching some shows. I wrote a book about the Orville. Have you seen this book?
Ooh, no, bring it down. Bring it down. Tell us where people can
Guide
find
to
it.
the Orville.
Oh, terrific.
I
Okay.
may have
It's
seen it
a
pop around, but I
in-universe
don't think I've
book.
actually pulled it out.
Yeah, it was a lot of
Excellent.
fun to do. I was asked to come up with a concept for an in-universe book about the Orville, meaning, you know,
Oh, I
we
love
treat the ship and
in-universe stuff.
the crew as if they're
Yeah.
real people.
Right.
And so what I came up with was an idea for doing essentially a young officer's guide. So if you're
Okay.
fresh out of Union Point and your first deep space assignment is going to be the Orville, what do you need to know about the ship, its crew, its history, its most important missions, the culture of the ship?
Yeah.
Do not
And then
mess
I
with Isaac
created,
too much.
yeah. And then I came up with the idea of, instead of doing episode synopses, which are boring generally, and you can find them online,
Right.
I included personal logs from the crew
Oh,
uh,
wow.
for each of the episodes of the show from the perspective of the character who was most affected in that episode. So it
Awesome.
gives you a little
Oh,
sort of different take on the
now I
I
got to
like
episode.
go
it.
find the one with Kelly and the religion that started about it.
Yes,
That'll be
yes.
interesting.
And Matt Cushman did an amazing 3D cutaway of the Orville. This was a lot
Ooh.
of work in and of itself. And if you buy the deluxe edition, just a pitch here, you get a
Pitch.
poster-sized version of this bad boy that Matt did.
Oh,
That
I like it.
that may be happening in the not too distant
That's pretty
future.
great. This
Oh,
is my favorite part of the book, frankly,
yeah.
because I
One more
love
time.
that sort of stuff.
One more time. What's the name of the book, and can we
Oh,
find it in
yes,
bookstores
called
and
The
on
Guide
Amazon?
to the Orville. You can find it on Amazon. It's published by Dark Horse.
Oh, terrific!
Nice.
Oh, and I
Hey,
love Dark.
just
As a comic guy, I love Dark Horse.
Oh, yeah.
just a quick thing. Have you seen? There's a I think it's the Orville Project. I forget. Messy Desk runs it, where they've built it inside Unreal Engine. You can walk around the ship
Oh, I have not seen
online.
it.
Yeah,
Oh,
so
wow.
there's a group that they got Seth's permission to do it, and so they've
Yeah.
built the entirety of the inside of the ship, and you can fly it around.
Oh,
So
wow.
and it's
I'll have to look
multiplayer,
at
so you can bring like people with you, and you can walk around the ship. You can role play
Oh,
if you
that's
want,
so
or you can
cool.
just be like, hey, I was on this set and I stood over
Yeah,
here.
right.
So it's
Oh,
really
wow.
neat.
Oh, that's great. I'll look for that. Send me the
Oh, that's
link
awesome.
if you think of it.
Yeah, I'll do that.
All right.
That's awesome. Well, you can certainly tell Seth that you have recruited a new Second Look fan, and that I've been following him since the very first
My
episode.
work here is done.
Yeah, the very first episode of Family Guy
You have
back
done
after
what
the
I
Super
could
Bowl in
not.
'99. Yeah, good deal. Well, oh my gosh, Andre, this has been terrific. Thank you so much
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. It was,
for
it
joining.
was, it
Yeah,
was really fun talking to you guys. Great to
ab-
meet you, and we'll hopefully talk again someday.
absolutely. And Patreons, thanks for tuning in. If you're listening to this on our network feed, you can visit patreon.com/Secret Friends Unite. Try us out for 7 days for free. Listen to a ton of other backlog of great interviews like this ones that we've done. We'd love to have you. And our guest has been Andre Bormanis. Thank you again.
You're very welcome. Thank you, guys.
This podcast is part of the Secret Friends Unite podcasting network, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and podcast services around the galaxy, as well as video on our YouTube channel. You can support Secret Friends Unite by becoming a Patreon member, get bonus programs and more over at patreon.com/secretfriendsunite. Join our Discord community for even more discussions on all things geek. For all the latest updates on Secret Friends Unite, make sure to follow us on Threads at secret.friends.unite and visit secretfriendsunite.com. Find our merchandise at TeePublic and Redbubble. Thanks for listening, and may the Force live long and prosper.